It's been 2 years since the release of Baldur's Gate 3. I've played many games before and after I played Baldur's Gate 3, but no matter what, I always see myself coming back to the amazing world of Faerun to once again relive the magic of my very first playthrough. Everything that this game has to offer still lingers with me to this day. Maybe it's the game's fantastic characters, maybe it's the game's sheer abundance of choices, or maybe it's just the fact that a product as well crafted and incredible as Baldur's Gate 3 is just so extremely rare in today's gaming industry. Whatever the reason for this, today I wanted to take a step back and reflect on Baldur's Gate 3, taking a detailed look at all of its various aspects and its profound legacy in the industry 2 years later. Also quickly, if you enjoy this type of content, please consider subbing to the channel and dropping a like, and without further ado, let's get right into it. There's a reason why people still talk about the release of Baldur's Gate 3 as if it was a once-in-a-generation moment, and that's because it kind of was. In an era where it's just expected for most AAA games to launch broken and incomplete, Larian's game dropped like it had wandered from another universe. The game was fully voiced, mostly polished, and most importantly, it was fully realized. The game consisted of 3 sprawling and unique acts with hundreds of hours of replayable and consistently enjoyable content for you to dig into. Larian didn't just launch an RPG, but they released an enormous, almost miraculous game in a time where that just isn't the norm anymore. Only a few days after the game's official launch, it hit over 850,000 concurrent players just on Steam. And this wasn't because of a flashy marketing budget, but its eccentric word of mouth. YouTube videos about how games like this shouldn't be possible, clips of people doing the most ridiculous antics with the game's mechanics, all of it was just amazing to look at. And it's true that this shouldn't be possible at this scale, at this level of detail. Yet it did, because Larian's passion made it all happen. To me, there's almost something accidental about how everything so perfectly came together for Baldur's Gate 3. And not accidental in the sense that the developers of course didn't plan for it, but accidental in how rare it is for true ambition, polish, player freedom, and mainstream success to align like this. From the get-go, pretty much the entire experience was just all there, and it wasn't a live service half-baked product, but a handcrafted experience that gave you all the tools from the get-go. As soon as you start your journey, you could choose who to side with, who to betray, what class to use, and who to romance, and all of it would just work. Even outside the game's mechanics, the presentation of Baldur's Gate 3 feels like a flex. The game isn't just fully narrated, but it's performed with every line voiced, every minor NPC animated, and with every dialogue sequence given a level of detail that many games would only reserve for their biggest moments. It's not flawless for sure, but it works, and 2 years later, almost no other game has even come close to capturing the scope of Baldur's Gate 3. The game isn't just a technical marvel, but it's a creative one that captures the sort of lightning in a bottle that comes from a studio that is completely committed to building a finished product rather than giving us something half-baked. And yet what I think made Baldur's Gate 3's launch feel like a cultural strike was just the pure freedom of the experience. The stories that players were sharing were all so distinct and showed that the game wasn't just one note, but diverged into a countless number of unique paths, all shaped by your own input. It wasn't just that the game allowed for this, but it was that it actually accounted for it. NPCs reacted to your every movement and word, dialogue sequences would completely change, quests would evolve, and with all of this, no system collapsed under pressure, but instead bent and responded to your choices. Of course, I believe that what made this all the more incredible was the context in which Baldur's Gate 3 launched. When the game launched back in August of 2023, the industry was just exhausted. Starfield was on the horizon and would land to controversial reception just a few weeks later. Diablo 4 started strongly but fizzled out quickly, and players like me and you had spent the last few years watching titles like Cyberpunk 2077 arrive incomplete or altogether half functional. And into all of that fatigue stepped a Dungeons & Dragons game, and one that became a phenomenon. Baldur's Gate 3 had no battle pass, no microtransactions, and no apology post by the devs on Twitter, but it was just a damn good game. I definitely think it's fair to compare its reception and release to games like Elden Ring and The Witcher 3, as it had just as much cultural presence as both of those titles. It wasn't just critics praising it, but everyone from hardcore CRPG fans to first-time players like myself who had never rolled a die in a game before were taken aback in a way that games rarely do. The community truly did explode in just a matter of days, and Baldur's Gate 3 became the talk of the entire industry for many months. To me, what makes all of this even more wild is that Larian never overpromised, because they didn't need to. The game really did speak for itself. Sure, early access players knew what to expect for the most part from Act 1, but Acts 2 and 3 were a complete mystery. Each new region you'd step in, from the Shadow-Cursed lands in Act 2 to the staggeringly beautiful city of Baldur's Gate in Act 3, even in spite of performance issues, all of it was filled with side quests, secrets, and choices that truly mattered. The game definitely isn't perfect, and I'll discuss that in a later section of the video, but even with all of its jank, it didn't matter. The scope, the vision, and the execution of Larian's vision felt genuine. To this day, 2 years after the game's release, many players such as myself are still chasing that great feeling that Baldur's Gate 3 gave us on the first time round. Larian reminded everyone what games could be when they're done with passion and care, and that's what I believe made Baldur's Gate 3's release feel like lightning in a bottle, and is precisely why it still lingers. I feel that we can all agree that there's something deeply special about the way Baldur's Gate 3 builds its world. And I don't just mean this in terms of its scope, but its actual design. Every area and region you visit across the game's 3 acts doesn't just feel like a new map, but it feels like an entire shift of the game's philosophy of level design, atmosphere, and storytelling. Even 2 years later, walking back through these areas never feels like retracing old steps, but it genuinely feels like stepping into a world that's still alive and still brimming with things that you didn't catch the first time. And that's because chances are me and you did miss something, and I think it's fair to say that everyone did. The game's world is split across 3 major acts, that being the wilderness, underdark, and mountain pass of Act 1, the Shadow-Cursed lands of Act 2, and of course the city of Baldur's Gate in Act 3. And all of these respective areas are complex in their own ways. Let's take Act 1 for a second. What looks like just a surface wilderness is actually layered with incredible vertical design. You'll scale ruined towers, leap from cliffs, or descend deep beneath the world into the Underdark, and every one of these paths lead to real and quality content. Entire quest lines, characters, gear, and even alternate routes to the game's key objectives will all present itself to you. The game doesn't just allow you to explore, but it actively rewards it. That locked cellar you almost missed, it might lead to an arcane vault. That side path through a ravine, it might let you bypass the goblin camp entirely. And I think that's the thing with Baldur's Gate 3. It rarely wastes its spaces. Every corner of the world of Faerun is dense with interactivity. It's why we still talk about finding secrets to this day, even if it's our 10th playthrough. Whether it was the discovery of the Myconid colony deep in the Underdark, or stumbling upon the psycho rituals within the House of Healing, the game constantly makes you feel like there's more for you to discover. And unlike most other RPGs where certain areas are obviously designed to be filler or glorified fetch zones, here they almost always offer some sort of narrative or gameplay payoff. Anywhere, and I mean anywhere you go in Baldur's Gate 3, you'll find unique dialogue, moral dilemmas to deal with, alternative routes, and so many surprising ways to resolve conflicts without engaging in combat. What makes all of these areas all the more impressive is how much of it is actually contextualized. In this, I mean that the environment isn't just designed, but it's actually inhabited. In the goblin camp, you overhear goblins arguing in the background about who gets to torture the prisoner. Then in Moonrise Towers, you hear cultists speaking with unsettling calm as they prepare for war. Even something as simple as an abandoned home might tell you a story, and this is not through a quest marker, but through letters on a table, corpses by the bed, or a blood trail leading into a basement. The game doesn't just casually throw all of its lore at you, but it embeds it into every space that you enter. And even without a single spoken word, the game will feed you stories of families, of heartbreaks, and of tragedies, all in a way that feels enjoyable to interact with. I believe Act 2's region, the Shadow-Cursed lands, also deserves a bit of a special mention. It's one of the most interesting settings that I've ever seen in a game. It's a region perpetually consumed by darkness, where stepping into the wrong path literally kills you without protection. But this isn't just an annoying gimmick of the gameplay, but the curse of the land is a manifestation of Ketheric Thorm's grief and the corruption of Merkul. As you continue to explore the region, whether in the Last Light Inn or the cursed village of Wraithwyn, you slowly peel back the layers of tragedy of the Thorm family. The Shadow-Cursed lands may arguably be the smallest region within the game, but it feels suffocating in the best way, as every landmark is soaked in despair, and the haunting environmental storytelling of what existed before tragedy struck is compelling in every single way. Then there's Act 3, featuring the iconic city of Baldur's Gate. It's for sure sure the most ambitious of all 3 acts in the game in terms of exploration, and while it definitely didn't launch as polished as the rest of the game, it's still just a remarkable achievement. The lower city is huge. You can enter shops, dungeons, sewer networks, foundries, towers, all with their own quests, characters, and branching outcomes. Some players would never have stumbled upon the circus, others might have missed the murders that plagued the city, and many others might have reached the game's ending without ever stepping foot in the Iron Throne. That's just how big this city really is. And while performance in Act 3 has improved since the initial release, what remains most impressive to me is the density of the environments. Every street corner within the city is tied to something, whether it be the political machinations of Gortash or the loud conclusion to the arc of one of your beloved companions. This is very much a city built not just as a final area, but as a culmination of everything you've done thus far. 2 years later, it's this replayable complexity that keeps Baldur's Gate 3's world feeling fresh. It's why we still discover new things to this day, and why new players still feel overwhelmed by how alive everything feels. Larian really did trust you, the player, with the world that they handcrafted, and they gave you the keys to immerse yourself into one of the most awe-inspiring and rewarding game worlds that I've ever played in. It is not often that a game creates a cast of characters so compelling that people connect with them, not just as party members, but as people. But that's exactly what Baldur's Gate 3 did. 2 years later, players still obsess over the cast in this game, and for very good reason. In a game where you can literally do anything, where your path will often twist and fracture in countless directions, these companions still feel like the beating heart of it all. Let's look at the example of Astarion first. What frankly starts as a cocky, bloodthirsty vampire spawn spirals into one of the most layered arcs in this entire game. His story isn't about being a monster, but it's about escaping becoming one. Astarion's clear trauma in being Khazador's puppet, his fear of losing control, and the intoxication of power once it's finally within reach, forces him to reckon with who he truly wants to be without someone else's leash around his neck. What makes his arc work so well, for example, is the way in which you as the player have complete authority in helping steer him towards healing or towards embracing cruelty. You can help him embrace his newfound freedom or let him become the very thing that he always feared. That duality and the manner in which you as the player define who he becomes is what makes his and every other companion's arcs stay with us. What starts out as simply a sarcastic vampire spawn becomes the tale of a scarred survivor who tries everything to maintain control over himself. Then there's of course my favorite companion in the game, Shadowheart. She's easily one of the most complex characters in this entire game. As a devoted cleric of the goddess Shah, she begins cold, repressed and guarded, but as the story unfolds, so does she. Her memories will slowly return to her as you continue with your journey, and doubts about her faith begin to surface. Ultimately, her quest is one that forces her to choose strictly between the paths of obedience and identity, between killing the Night Song or sparing her. Decisions like that are what her arc entails, and what it eventually culminates in. I think it's obvious to us all, as her arc progresses, that Shah expects more than just violence. She expects her followers to erase their identities in complete servitude to her. So when Shadowheart develops to the point where she rejects that, and finally steps into her own light, it definitely became one of the most satisfying character moments in any RPG I've ever played. Even her name, chosen for her by the cult she was indoctrinated in, becomes a symbol of her transformation, and whether you decide to romance her or not, her journey from simply a tool for Shah's cause to a fully realized person is unforgettable. Lae'zel, on the other hand, represents something entirely different to both of the characters I've already discussed, as her people breathe and die in the words of loyalty, indoctrination, and rage. From the moment that you meet her, she's barking orders at you, and it is apparent that she is a force of the ideology in which she was raised. She doesn't trust you, and she doesn't care about your self-shaped sense of morality. All she knows is the doctrine of her people, but in many ways mirroring that of Shadowheart, cracks begin to form in her rigid beliefs. When she finally does learn the truth about the false Lich Queen and her place as a liar and usurper, it's clear that her world collapses right in front of her. What I found most profound about her arc is how important your choices are in steering her, just like Shadowheart and Astarion, in clinging to the lie she was raised upon or forging a new path for her people. And really, that's the beauty of Lae'zel's arc. You don't just recruit Lae'zel, but you unmake her from what she is. You break her false belief systems and watch what is reborn from the ashes of that. Her defiance, strength, and eventual vulnerability actually feels earned. Then if you take this through all the way to the rebellion ending, leading her people against the queen that she once worshipped, it feels like the end of a real and well-developed journey unlike any other in the game. Now, I could go on a tangent and go through the game's fantastic cast of companions one by one, but I think you get the point with my my last few examples. Although to a lesser extent, I do believe that characters such as Karlach, Will, and Gale also represent the greatness of writing on display by Larian in relation to the companions. All of them have their own unique arcs, and they are all defined by something, either it be their pact with the devil for the greater good, or the mistakes they made when in the service of a goddess. Even beyond the game's 6 origin characters, the game also lets you travel alongside returning characters like Jaheira and Minsk. I definitely wouldn't say that they are as well written as the previously mentioned characters, but they still reflect a great level of quality in Larian's work and add something distinct to the game's party dynamic. I have not finished the original Baldur's Gate games, but I can only imagine that seeing a character like Jaheira after all of these years, older but still just as sharp, is one of the most incredible payoffs in this entire franchise. And the fact that she can die permanently if you mess up in Act 2 tells you that your choices define who these characters become, and that their fates altogether are yours to decide. And really, I think that's what makes this diverse cast so remarkable. It's not just that they're all written well for the most part, but it's the fact that they've been written with consequence in mind. Their arcs really do shift based on your actions. Their relationships evolve with you and with each other. Some will grow to love you, and some hate you. And because the game gives them space for all of this to happen, they start to feel alive. Even a couple years after our introduction to these characters for the first time, I don't think any game has still surpassed this party in scope, depth, or impact. It's clear to me that Baldur's Gate 3 didn't just give us all companions, but it gave us characters who we could actually and truly connect with. At this point, I think all of us know that in most games today, choice is just an illusion. You'll pick a dialogue option, the NPC will have one unique line related to it, and nothing else will change. But in Baldur's Gate 3, choice is the very engine that drives the story and gameplay forward. And 2 years later, it's still astonishing to me just how much this game remembers what you did, not just in the moment, but hours and sometimes acts later. Baldur's Gate 3 doesn't boast choices in quantity, but in actual consequence. Every major decision has weight, and often multiple different resolutions. As you pave your way through Faerun, you're not just shaping what the ending will be, but you're actively shaping how your journey will turn out. Let's take the prominent choice surrounding the Night Song, for example. We all followed the mystery of the Night Song through Acts 1 and 2, investigating what it actually was and hearing whispers about its true identity from both enemies and allies alike. Of course, it's eventually shown to be a living woman, Dame Aelin, and what happens to her is completely up to you. This decision is one of the greatest ones in the game for sure, as it doesn't only affect the rest of the narrative, but also the arc of Shadowheart's character. Kill her and you'll deepen her undying devotion to Shah. Spare her and you free a celestial being and give Shadowheart the chance to finally break free of indoctrination. The game doesn't present these choices on an obvious platter of good versus evil, but it allows you to choose and just reacts accordingly. And I think that perfectly sums up the thread of choice that runs throughout the entire game. Another great example of the game's incredible choices with real consequences is the character of Minthara. Siding with the goblins in Act 1 will allow you to spare and recruit her, but if you side with the druids and the tieflings, she's gone forever. Of course, there's now ways to recruit her without going down a particular path, but this just goes to show how multi-layered the game's choices really are. What's most striking about the various choices that are presented throughout the game is how often they will create completely different playthroughs. I've played through the game 4 times now, and every single run I see dialogue, cutscenes, and reactions that I had never seen in a prior run. In one run, you might infiltrate Moonrise Towers from within. Another, you might just storm the front gates, and even smaller quests like how you resolve the Zentrum hideout have so many different pathways. Some of these choices might influence which characters will trust you later in the story, while others will shift around the approval ratings of your companions, marking who will be loyal and who's a bit of a skeptic. Reactivity is everywhere in Baldur's Gate 3, not just in cutscenes, but in dialogue, quests, and the game's level design itself. If you enter a location through an unexpected path, the game will notice. If you kill a key NPC instead of talking to them, the quest might adapt or collapse entirely. If you sneak into the Iron Throne too late, Duke Ravengard dies. In Baldur's Gate 3, it's obvious that choice isn't just a flavor of the gameplay, but it's intended as a core design element in itself. Where in other games we often feel like we're trudging along an already woven path, in Baldur's Gate 3, you have the power to shape one yourself. Even the game's endings are not simply a matter of you making this choice and this choice earlier, but it's a proper culmination of everything you did all the way from Act 1 to Act 3. You have the ability to choose the power power of the Netherbrain, or to turn yourself into a mind flayer, and it's really all down to the type of story you'd like to make in this world. Often, these are shaped by decisions you made not just in the final act, but ones you made dozens of hours ago. The game's endings aren't like the infamous red, blue, and green endings of the Mass Effect trilogy, but the endings are shaped by the thread of choices you personally made throughout your journey. The game's choices and reactivity becomes most apparent when you click on the new game button and start another playthrough. In almost every playthrough that I've done, many things almost feel alien, with characters acting differently, dialogue changing, and new quests appearing. The idea that by doing just one playthrough that you've seen most of what Baldur's Gate 3 has to offer quickly vanishes. Every playthrough of this game, either it be your second playthrough or your 10th, reveals something new for you to discover, and not because it was hidden from you, but because you made different choices in prior playthroughs. 2 years later, this is what has stuck with me as the most important aspect that sets Baldur's Gate 3 apart from all the games that came before it. In Baldur's Gate 3, your choices don't just matter, but they've been built into the very DNA of the game as a whole, and many, such as myself, would say that the choices are the game's DNA. And in an industry where choices often are there for just fluff, Baldur's Gate 3 delivers on creating real and purposeful choices that shape the gameplay, your party, and the world around you. If the story of Baldur's Gate 3 is shaped by your choices, then its gameplay is defined by the limits of your creativity. In this game, the rules aren't there to restrict you, but they're there to be bent, broken, and twisted within every single fight. From the moment that the combat music starts, you're not just thinking about the enemy's HP or attacks, but you're thinking about the terrain around you, about whether you can shove someone off a ledge, or hurl an oil barrel towards a group of enemies hunched together, or sneak on top of a building and rain hell down from above. And really, to me, this is what makes Baldur's Gate 3 so endlessly addictive. Every encounter in this game isn't just a puzzle for you to solve, but it's a sandbox that gives you full control to make all the chaos that you want. At its core, Baldur's Gate 3 uses a modified version of D&D 5th edition. So that of course means turn-based combat, initiative rolls, and an action-based economy. Much like actual D&D where imagination guides the play, so does it in Baldur's Gate 3. Want to shove a boss off a platform instead of fighting them? Go for it. Want to sneak into a dungeon using invisibility and teleportation spells? Go for it. Here, it's not breaking the rules, but it's genuinely how you're expected to play. The gameplay systems of Baldur's Gate 3 thrive off and reward experimentation. 2 years on, I still see clips of people finding new ways to break the game. Entire builds have been designed around abusing the game's movement and initiative role systems, which has created absolutely insane gameplay potential. Builds like the iconic Stealth Archer by Morgana Evelyn or the Ice Sorcerer showcase the great potential for build crafting in this game, and this is all possible due to the way in which the game encourages you to experiment. These builds are not possible due to glitches, but they're by bending the very design of the game itself, and all of this is amplified by the game's sense of verticality. In Baldur's Gate 3, elevation actually matters, as high ground will often give you an advantage on your attack rolls. Positioning in combat is often the difference between getting your party wiped out and a flawless victory. It's almost like solving a puzzle, as before you get into a fight, you'll look around the environment and try to sneak a rogue up to a ledge, or go invisible and position one of your party members right behind the boss in front of you. The game's environments aren't just static battlefields like in many other games, but they're actually layered stages full of tools, traps, and opportunities that makes the game's combat even more flexible. And this flexibility isn't just in the game's combat. Baldur's Gate 3 gives a crap ton of non-combat tools to tackle problems that in many situations makes combat optional. Spells like invisibility and Misty Step aren't just fun gimmicks, but they're often viable and optimal solutions to getting around an encounter without directly engaging in combat. You can infiltrate a guarded keep without alerting anyone, or intimidate an NPC into revealing the information you need without actually fighting them. The entirety of Baldur's Gate 3's gameplay systems are built on player agency as its foundation, not just in dialogue, but in the moment-to-moment gameplay itself. What's even more impressive is how the game innately supports this level of player freedom in its gameplay. Every companion can be fully respec'd, any character can be multi-classed. If you want a paladin who can also cast a fireball spell, or a monk with a rogue's ability to sneak, it's all possible within Baldur's Gate 3. The systems aren't just deep and interactive, but they're flexible and designed for you to twist them as much as you want. And because every class and build in this game has its own strengths and weaknesses, the game becomes a playground for synergies. Crafting builds in this game is for sure one of my favorite aspects of it, as discovering the synergies between different classes, weapons, and spells creates some of the most satisfying gameplay I have ever experienced in any game. Even within the same class, the way you can make completely different builds through through the game's diverse and large number of subclasses is utterly incredible. Of course, when you combine this with the ability to multi-class, the possibilities for builds in combat are really just endless. It's the reason why to this day, people are still uploading build guides and new synergies within combat, because the game constantly tells you to be creative and do anything you want. But of course, I don't think none of these combat elements would matter if the game's enemy design didn't inherently support it, but it does. You fight a wide range of enemies throughout your journey in Baldur's Gate 3, from mind flayers to demons to dragons and more, all with different abilities and behavior. Some fights will encourage you to brute force your way through them, while others will need your knowledge of the environment around you. I think one of my favorite parts about this is how the game rewards pre-fight preparation, from placing oil barrels, casting buffs, or positioning your party in advance. This preparation becomes part of the gameplay loop, and it constantly evolves in line with the types of enemies that you're fighting. At its very best, the combat and gameplay systems of Baldur's Gate 3 makes you feel like a director, and allows you to make the game as cinematic, dynamic, and fun as you possibly can. I've played through many games, and no game has even come close to the sort of freedom that Baldur's Gate 3 offers in its gameplay, and especially not at this scale. But Baldur's Gate 3 does this all because it was designed with player agency in mind, and you're constantly expected to break the game as much as you can. And 2 years later, this is why the game still has people finding new builds, tricks, and ways to solve old problems, because it really lets you do anything you want. For everything that Baldur's Gate 3 gets right, and that's quite a lot of things, there are quite a few problems that I'd also like to talk about. These are more minor issues when looking at the experience as a whole, but they're still there and still worth mentioning. This game does have issues, especially those in Act 3. From the very beginning, Act 3 feels different, both in a good way and a bad way. I don't mean this in terms of its content, but in how this content is actually executed in practice. Where Acts 1 and 2 felt tightly tuned with their content, Act 3 often feels bloated and sometimes unfinished. When the game first came out, this was most noticeable in the performance, with frame drops, stutters, and bugs even on higher end machines. And while many of these issues have been patched over time, it's obvious that even now, the game's lower city portion still remains its weakest technical part. But performance is only one part of the story. The bigger issue for me and many other players is just the pacing of Act 3. Act 3 chucks a ton of quests at you, from side stories to the endings of your companion arcs. And often it feels like instead of a gradual build up, it often feels like everything in this act is competing for screen time. Let's take the quest with Feloga's fireworks for example. I'm not a big fan of this quest at all, and I think it is a great example of some of the big problems with Act 3's quest design. This quest just feels unfinished, as its resolution is not at all satisfying, and the reactivity you have in earlier game quests is pretty much all gone in this one. Another quest is that of Karlach's companion quest. It's clear more so in this act than in any other that the game did have some cut content, and while for the most part that never distracts from the experience, in Karlach's quest something just feels off. Even if you do every single thing right, her engine would just never get fixed, and she'll either die or need to disappear into Avernus forever just to survive. This was made an even bigger problem when the game launched, as there was no true epilogue. The game just cut to black and the credits would roll. Although now the game does have an epilogue, it still sometimes feels to me the weight of some of the choices that you make in Act 3, especially in regard to your companions, are all wrapped up messily in the epilogue. I will admit this did annoy me on my first playthrough, as characters like Karlach and Will feel like they were left out in getting proper satisfying resolutions to their character arcs, despite the fact that they've been with you from the very beginning of the game. That's without even mentioning the game's two latest additions into your party, Jaheira and Minsc. They're returning legends from the original Baldur's Gate games, but out of all of the companions, especially Minsc, they have little to no reactivity. In this, I mean that they don't react to your choices very much, and in the case of Minsc especially, he doesn't even have his own companion quest. He's instead part of Jaheira's one, and he often just feels like the comedic relief of the camp without offering much else. And going back to the point earlier about reactivity, I think that's what makes Act 3 feel a little off when compared to the game's first two acts, where in Acts 1 and 2, every decision you made either for yourself or on behalf of a fellow companion would be reacted to and responded to by every single companion in your party. Many of the major decisions in Act 3 just don't have this. It's almost as if they're not paying attention to what you're doing. And I mean, this could be when you're tackling the House of Hope or diving into the Iron Throne to save the Gondians. Act Act 3 is really a letdown in this department, and I think it's just amplified by the fact that in terms of sheer content and scale, it is by far the game's biggest act. This of course means that more than any other act in the game, it needed to have a level of reactivity that reflected its scope, but unfortunately that isn't a reality for the most part. Another gripe I have with this act is just how easy the gameplay gets at this point. Yes, I understand that as it's in the endgame, you'll be accustomed to the combat design of the game to the point where you'll fly through most of the encounters, but still, I think the game's level cap of 12 makes it feel like your character's progression halts very early in Act 3. I remember in my first playthrough, I hit level 12 only a couple hours into Act 3, and so that made it feel like for the rest of my 20 to 30 hours in the act that I wasn't really progressing my character's power in any way. This also makes the major boss fights in Act 3, which there are many of, just feel like a snooze fest when you compare them to the boss fights of Act 2, for example with Ketheric Thorm. Orin and Gortash were super easy for most players to tackle, and although Raphael was a bit on the harder side, it still felt comparatively easy to the rest of the game's major fights. And with all that, although Larian has consistently tried to polish over the errors of this act, it still feels like the weakest link of a game that excels in every other way. Still, even with all these cracks, Baldur's Gate 3 remains one of the best RPGs ever made. Its flaws don't diminish it, but they remind us all of how just wildly ambitious this game really was. And maybe that's what makes it so special. Larian aimed higher than most other studios would dare to, and even when the game stumbles, it's stumbling towards something truly great. 2 years on, I think Baldur's Gate 3 still lingers because it reminded me of what games could be. Not what they were promised to be, and not what they're patched into becoming, but what they are when passion and player trust come together in one fantastic package. For me, it wasn't just a great RPG, but it was a genuinely rare moment in the industry where a studio took their time and built a game that they truly believed in and would play themselves. Yes, the game isn't perfect as I just discussed, but I take what I got in the end over a game that plays it safe and to the mark any day. Baldur's Gate 3 gave us all a game with a story that felt like our own. The companions were written like real people, and the world didn't just react to you, but it actively listened. Every part of the game feels like it was handcrafted, and even today, no other game has captured that same feeling for me. Baldur's Gate 3 is a clear lesson to the rest of the industry, and it is a reminder of what happens when a developer truly cares for their product. It's a game that lets players have the freedom to create their own stories in a world that feels like it's listening, and that's why it matters, and why it probably always will.